Are Libya's fortunes changing after weeks of fighting? Warlord Khalifa Haftar says he's putting his country first by handing over control of oil export terminals. Oil prices fall as the taps are turned full on again. So why the about-face? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. International pressure appears to have worked with Libya's strongman Khalifa Haftar. Following fierce fighting with a rival army for control of 4 oil ports, he's handed them over to the internationally recognised National Oil Corporation. It expects exports of Libya's lifeblood to get back to normal soon. Haftar says he's putting his country first by handing over the oil ports, but his forces retain control of important oil fields. Al Jazeera's Mahmoud Abdul Wahed reports from Tripoli.
After nearly 3 weeks of blockade by forces loyal to Khalifa Haftar, Libya's warlord has handed over control of 4 oil terminals to the internationally recognized National Oil Corporation based in Tripoli.
I congratulate all Libyans for the resumption of oil exporting. Hopefully it will return with profit for everyone. I personally thank all those who contributed to end this crisis, especially those who acted rationally and wisely.
Pressure from the US, the UK, Italy and France, as well as regional powers, seems to have forced Haftar to relinquish control. He was planning to keep the ports under the supervision of the Benghazi-based oil corporation, which is allied to Libya's rival parliament based in Tobruk.
The handover of the oil terminals and resumption of exporting operations is a boost for the oil-dependent economy. Some would say the handover saves it from collapse. But it doesn't mean the end of the conflict in eastern Libya, with Haftar's enemies remaining nearby the so-called oil crescent.
Who controls Libya's oil is questionable, because the country remains divided between 2 governments, one based in Tripoli, the other in the eastern city of Al-Bayda. The latest conflict started on June the 14th, when forces loyal to the former chief of the Petroleum Facilities Guard, Ibrahim Jadran, briefly took control of the largest oil terminals, Sidra and Ras Lanouf. At least 2 oil storage tanks were set on fire, and exports stopped as tankers were turned away from the Zweitina and Hruiga terminals. The 4 ports were recaptured by Haftar's forces, reportedly with the help of the Egyptian and UAE Air Force. Despite handing over the ports, Haftar retains control of oil fields. The latest fight over the lifeblood exports is estimated to have cost the economy more than $1 billion. Previous battles since the death of Muammar al-Gaddafi 7 years ago caused production to fluctuate. Restoring full output is a top priority, both for foreign customers and Libya's National Oil Corporation, which is promising production will be back to normal soon. Mahmoud Abdul Wahed, Al Jazeera, Tripoli.
Well, Libya's oil crescent stretches along the Mediterranean coast between the cities of Sirte and Benghazi to the east. The region contains 80% of Libya's estimated 45 billion barrels of oil reserves, as well as huge amounts of gas. And it contains 3 of Libya's largest oil fields, plus refineries that produce around 60% of exports. Oil tankers dock at 5 main ports. Sidra is the largest, exporting 400,000 barrels a day, followed by Ras Lanouf at 220,000 barrels. So who is Khalifa Haftar? Well, described until recently as a renegade general and now warlord, Haftar has been part of the political scene in Libya for 40 years. He helped Muammar Gaddafi seize power in 1969 before they fell out. Haftar returned from exile 7 years ago and joined the uprising that toppled and killed the longtime dictator. Haftar made himself an important player in 2015 by declaring a campaign to drive armed groups out of Benghazi, Libya's 2nd biggest city in the oil-rich east. Libya has an internationally recognized government in Tripoli and a 2nd administration in Tobruk, which supported Haftar's offensive. The UN brokered a deal to create a unity government 2 years ago, but Haftar said support from his self-declared Libyan National Army was unthinkable, and he's been accused of actively trying to undermine a unified government. With UAE and Egyptian support, he ordered his self-declared National Army to seize control of Libya's major oil ports last month. So, let's introduce our panel for today's discussion. From London, we're joined by Sami Hamdi, the editor-in-chief of International Interest. From Tripoli, Salah Al-Bakush, who is a political analyst and senior advisor to the negotiating team of the High Council of States. And also in London, Tom Pepper, a North Africa and East Mediterranean correspondent at Energy Intelligence. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Sami, let's start with you. After a 3-week dispute that effectively shut down the country's oil industry, why would General Haftar hand control of these oil ports back to the National Oil Corporation?
First of all, let's remember that the decision by Khalifa Haftar to seize the oil terminals and block oil exports within the Libyan domestic scene was actually a very shrewd move. Essentially, Haftar wanted to tell the international community that I am the man to deal with, I am the future leader of Libya, and I control the resources that you need. The problem is, however, for Khalifa Haftar, and why he will be very angry today, is that it took his decision to shut off the oil exports comes about at a time of very high oil prices and a very angry US president as a result of these high oil prices. We know that Donald Trump has been exerting significant pressure on the region in order to increase production and reduce oil prices. And he's put out tweets to this effect, blaming certain countries, saying it will be your fault if it goes above $100 a barrel. The most likely scenario, in my opinion, is that the UAE, which previously suggested it would increase production, I think the UAE, under pressure from Donald Trump, pressured Haftar. Remember, UAE is the main backer of Haftar, to reopen oil exports. And I think the way in which they convinced Haftar to do so was to say, look, you're still technically in control of these terminals. You still have your military forces there. Maybe wait until the situation internationally is better, and then you can repeat this move once more in order to exert your influence. Moreover, from Haftar's perspective, another thing that will make him feel perhaps a bit more comfortable is his increasingly warm relationship with France and general talk within the EU that perhaps there is a benefit in increasing ties with Haftar, in having warmer relations with Haftar, because he may well be the one who unites Libya in the end. The reality is that Haftar did not want to surrender these terminals. He didn't do it in the national interest. He did it simply because everybody, including his own supporters, demanded that he open those terminals once more. And in particular, in my opinion, the UAE. Let's remember that high oil prices caused by this decision affects everybody in the world. Affects the US, affects UAE, affects Saudi Arabia, affects Italy, which has a struggling economy and which is also trying to deal with its own migration crisis. It affects the EU, which is seeking to establish greater deals with Libya, as reflected in the Vienna Agreement. So I think here, Haftar thought he did a shrewd tactical move, but it was, unfortunately for him, at the wrong time.
Salah Al-Bakush, what's your take on this? This isn't the first time that Haftar has taken control of these oil terminals. What was his motive for handing control of the ports back this time? If he'd taken control of them to perhaps institutionalize his LNA in the east of the country with perhaps the aim of moving towards a de facto partition between the west and the east, then why on earth would he hand control back?
I think he handed... look, as you suggest, this is not the first time. It's important to note that what this signifies, this whole mess, is that the struggle in Libya is not, as some try to explain it neatly, as a struggle between moderates and extremists, Islamists and secularists, East and West. It is a struggle over who controls the resources of the state. And that's what Haftar is trying to do. In 2016, he took the ports from his ex-comrade, Jadran, and handed it immediately to the NOC in Tripoli, because at that time he was looking for legitimacy, for appearing to be the savior of the Libyans and so on, and to reserve a seat for him at the table. He had that the French invited him last year with Sarraj, and this year with Sarraj and Mishri and Aguila Saleh and so on. Now he took these oil ports and he wants something more. He wants the NOC itself and or the central bank. It's a blackmail operation that failed miserably. The Saudi Gazette, which is usually a safe Haftar supporter, said that Haftar blundered badly into an impossible situation that will greatly diminish his international credibility. That's what happened. I mean, the scenario that your previous guest is talking about, that this is a shrewd move and the UAE and so on, it's not. He tried to blackmail the Libyan state and he failed. And now we'll see what his next move is.
Tom, I'll come to you in just a moment. But Sami, do you want to just come back there?
I think the other guest is giving too much credit to the Libyan state, which in reality is unable to exert influence anywhere in particular. I think the evidence that the NOC genuinely thought that Haftar had conducted himself in a very serious manner that could convince the international community of his credentials is reflected in the way how in the Vienna conference, when he received the news, he pleaded with European companies not to deal with Haftar, an admission that he knew that companies were thinking about dealing with Haftar. So I think there's too much credit being given to Tripoli. At the end of the day, the problem with Haftar's move is simply that it hurt even his own supporters. The high oil price is a very serious problem, and you can see Trump's trepidation and anger and desperation in trying to bring this oil price down. And indeed, opening these oil exports once more is bringing these oil prices down. We've seen it go down 6%, which I think will ease some of those particular concerns. However, as your guest illustrated, Haftar is being received in France. He's being taken as a serious contender, and it is genuinely a fight for the resources in Libya. Haftar's ideal situation is to take control of either the central bank or the national oil company, because then he sets himself up to be one of the major players in Libya and then somebody who cannot be ousted in any negotiation that takes place, no matter how much Tripoli tries. The reality in Libya, I'll finish on this point, the reality on Libya, contrary to what people would like to think, is that Haftar militarily and politically is in the ascendancy, in contrast to Tripoli.
OK, Tom Pepper, Sami mentioned a few minutes ago this letter that US President Donald Trump has written, strongly worded, to the heads of Libya's rival governments, threatening legal action against those that he deems responsible for not solving the oil crescent conflict in the east of the country. Is Libya's oil important to global markets?
Yes, it is. Despite the situation in Libya, which sadly is very, very difficult, political crisis ongoing, UN trying to find a solution, Libya's oil, when it does come on stream, does affect, as we've seen recently, the global oil price, with the Brent crude benchmark rising to around $80 per barrel as a result of the outage, 10-day outage. And when it came back on stream, we're now talking around $74 per barrel. So Libya does matter. It's an OPEC member, clearly. Output was hovering around 1 million barrels a day before this shutdown, and then roughly halved to 570,000 barrels a day. Libya has developed, unfortunately for Libya, a wildcard status in global oil markets. It has the ability to affect the global oil price from any shutdown and any restart of production. So yes, Libya does matter, and what happens in Libya matters. And EU governments, the US, the UN all know this, and that is clearly why they're trying to find a solution.
So, Tom, what is President Trump's strategy here? Why send this letter threatening legal action?
Well, if legal action, I have to say, I'm not entirely sure why he would hit Trump's strategy in this case. But I think what I've seen, there's two positives from Libya's National Oil Corporation's position, that they have managed to prevent, with backing from the UN, the US, UK, France and Germany, any illicit sales of Libyan crude, which, if we just walk back a bit, Haftar handed over recently, 10 days ago, supposedly handed over these 4 ports to Eastern oil officials who, since 2015, have tried to sell state crude on the open market and have failed. And the reason they failed is because of targeted UN sanctions. And as far as we know at Energy Intelligence, they have not managed to actually successfully sell a cargo, although they tried several times and registered several companies. So I think the US, as far as I'm aware, are, certainly from their statements recently, irrespective of Trump's recent letter, are fully backing the government, the UN-backed government of Fayez Sarraj. And they have to also continue to back the independence of both the central bank but also the Tripoli-based National Oil Corporation, which has done quite a sterling job in the face of a lot of challenges thrown at it recently.
And Tom, does President Trump have one eye perhaps on the sanctions that he intends to put upon Iran later this year?
Perhaps. I mean, in terms of oil markets, when Libya goes down, there's other on the horizon, other potential disruptions to the oil market coming from obviously Venezuela, the potential implosion there of the domestic scene, and also from targeted sanctions on Iran. And if you're a Mediterranean refiner, you want to have some sort of reliability of supply. And the problem here in Libya is that increasingly, when we have these shutdowns or these restarts, it sends the message that you cannot really rely on them as a reliable supplier of crude to refiners, to world markets. And it's really something that's out of the control of National Oil Corporation. It does not control the ports and the fields that it has under its control, or its states has under its control, simply for the reason that these militias and also even the Libyan National Army, which pledged allegiance to National Oil Corporation, really has the ultimate hand over these ports and can shut them down at will. And this is the sad fact, the reality. You had a situation just last month where these ports changed hands 3 times. Jathran's militia took over, then they were displaced by Haftar, and Haftar decided, whatever his motivation, to hand them over to Eastern oil officials for 10 days. So it's very hard for NOC to say that they have complete control over their facilities.
Salah al-Bukush, as Tom was saying, that when Haftar took control of the oil ports, he allowed this rival version of the National Oil Corporation based in Beida to sell the oil. What was his thinking by that? What was his strategy?
Look, despite the messages of reassurance that Sami is trying to send to Haftar supporters, the fact remains, and everybody knows it, that the power institutions in the East have neither the technical nor the administrative or legal basis to be able to sell crude oil. The EPSA agreements that the NOC in Tripoli has with the production and exploration companies cannot allow that power institution in Beida to do anything. Haftar never intended to sell or market and produce oil in the East through those miniature organizations. All along, his aim was to blackmail the state into giving him the central bank and or the NOC. And I did not say that thanks to the state of Libya that foiled this blackmail attempt. On the contrary, what foiled this attempt was the international community and their trust in Sanallah, the head of the NOC. The NOC was doing an excellent job. It was always on the neutral, and it was producing the oil, selling it, and the money goes to the central bank. The question of where the money goes then is not Sanallah, and the international community knows that if this oil gets blocked, the whole state of affairs in Libya will get much, much worse than what it is now.
Sami, what do you make of that? I mean, Haftar's main international supporters, France, Egypt, the UAE, were definitely not supportive of his action of taking control of these ports, were they?
I think initially maybe the UAE and Egypt would have been, but for the pressure of the US president. I do agree with the guest when he says that Sanallah's administration of the NOC has established a lot of confidence among international partners, and they are very keen to ensure the independence of the NOC in order to ensure the continuation of the exports of oil, irrespective of what happens in the conflict. And I think this attitude actually speaks volumes of the role that the international community has played in exacerbating the conflict in Libya. We have to remember who Haftar takes as an inspiration to continue his military expansion in Libya. He takes Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt. And I say this because Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt ousted a democratically elected president from power in first free and fair elections that took place in Egypt. The international community's subsequent recognition of Sisi, despite the military coup, despite what happened in Rab'a and the incredible crackdown on human rights abuses, this tells Haftar one thing, that if I can conquer Libya and if I can continue to militarily expand and establish effective control of Libya's resources, it doesn't matter who is right or wrong in Libya. It doesn't matter where the justice is. All that matters for the international community is who controls Libya and can they provide stability. And I think this is the failure of the international community, that it has failed to defend the values that it espouses. And I think with regards to Haftar, when you look at the international community, how one way it gives the impression it's willing to deal with Haftar, the next day it wants to maintain the independence of the NOC, the next day Haftar is in Paris, the next day we see all of a sudden Fayez Sarraj being put as an internationally recognized government over militias who don't even recognize his authority. You see that there is a profound failure from the international community. And I think this whole oil saga sums it up correctly.
Okay, Salah al-Bakush, do you want to come back on that? And to what extent is competition for influence between France and Italy in Libya affecting the situation?
Well, it is, but you know, Macron tried his hand, you know, in a very amateurish way last year when he put together a couple, Sarraj and Haftar, and announced that this is a great moment and that Sarraj represents political legitimacy while Haftar represents military legitimacy. And the two guys, 24 hours after that and before they left Paris, they got into it with each other. Haftar is telling Sarraj to stop these childish moves, and Sarraj says, well, you cannot solve the problem militarily. And then they put them together in Paris last month, and you see what happens now after that fanfare, and we agree, and we're gonna disable the terror institutions and so on. So Italy now with the far right, probably they are closer to Trump, and they will get a fair hearing from him, and that's, they try to protect their interests, and they think that France is interfering in their sphere of influence, and they're going to fight back.
Tom Pepper, I have a feeling this is going to be the last question here because we're almost out of time. How important is oil revenue to Libya, given that there's no one central organisation or government controlling the company? You've got this ongoing political impasse, all of the various rivalries between the governments in the east and the west, and the various militia operating within the country.
Well, as you said, yes, no, it's oil revenue is vital to the country. It's really the mainstay of the economy, obviously. And even if National Oil Corporation misses selling just one cargo, that impacts state finances. And one cargo is, say, 600,000 to 1 million barrels of crude. So any shutdown for any length of period costs the costs the state coffers several millions of dollars, if not billion. So it matters a great deal. And in fact, the way that payments are made by refineries, by international oil companies, is through the Libyan Foreign Bank. There's a bank account there that is then paid with the Libyan Foreign Bank as a subsidiary of the central bank. From the central bank, it is the central bank that distributes salaries throughout the country. But without clearly any successful cargoes being sold, that flood of money goes down to a trickle. So it is vital, yes.
Gentlemen, we're out of time. Many thanks indeed to all of you, Sami Hamdi, Salah al-Bakush, and to Tom Pepper. Don't forget, you can see the programme at any time by visiting our website. aljazeera.com is where you'll find us. For further discussion on today's topic, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or you can join the conversation on Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.